So now we're going to take a look at how American society starts to change in the 1920s. The 1920s is usually known by the nickname the Roaring Twenties, right? So, think about roar, you know what I mean? Like, that's, when do you roar? Like you roar when you're like, let's party, and that kind of wild, roaring 20s. That's the idea that this is a time of really significant changes in society. But just like any big party, sometimes you always have the neighbor who's, banging on the floor. You guys got to quiet down. And I mean, that's the thing, is that when you have these tremendous cultural changes, not everyone's going to agree. And that's really what the 1920s is about. There's a lot of conflicts because American society is going to change and not everybody's going to be on board with this. That the cultural values of American people, there's going to be a lot of disagreements about the direction of the country. Is it going in a good direction or a bad direction? Anyway, the first thing the 1920s is known for, and where we're going to start, is with Prohibition. And again, this is one of those situations where there's a group of people in society who think that the availability of alcohol is an evil, evil thing in society. And that, remember, we came out of that progressive movement in the late 1800s. And the whole idea of the progressive movement is that the government should be making progress, right? Should try to fix any kind of societal problems, anything that's making society bad. The government has a role in fixing things. So a lot of people look at alcohol, and you can see from the political cartoon, right? A saloon, a place where alcohol is sold. Well, what is it built from? And they're saying, look at the bricks that you build a saloon from, or dishonored names and wrecked lives and lost virtue and lost reputation and ruined fortunes and, all these things, that people become alcoholics and it just ruins their lives. And so the idea is that since alcohol is such a terrible thing for society, that it's the cause of poverty and health issues, crimes and violence, that we should make alcohol illegal, okay? And that's the push. And this kind of push to make alcohol illegal, this is a conflict. Really, some people look at it as kind of a conflict between the urban and the rural. That in rural areas and more country areas, more traditional areas, is a big push to, there's where there's a lot of support to make alcohol illegal. Versus in the urban areas, in the cities, they're a little bit more cosmopolitan, there's more acceptance of alcohol. So some people look at this, as a conflict. Now, I have to put this out there. This is not 100% one, 100% of the other. There are people in the city who hate alcohol, who, want to rip through bars and thinks it's evil. Same thing in the country. There are people who love alcohol in the country, who set up their stills to make moonshine and think that alcohol is completely acceptable. You get what I'm saying? It's not 100%. But generally speaking, the push to make alcohol illegal has more acceptance in the country than it does in the cities, in the urban areas. And this push against alcohol, a lot of people look at it as a morality issue, that to be moral, to be ethical, to be a good person means you don't drink. And also it's, somewhat religious. Some people think, to be a good Christian can't drink. So again, this is that conflict in society, city versus urban rather, and traditional versus, more cosmopolitan, more different. All right. So in the 1800s, this is where the temperance movement starts. And you have to know this word, temperance. Temperance is the anti-alcohol movement. So if you talk about the temperance movement, you are talking about making alcohol illegal. Make sure you know that word, okay? So this is where you start to see these temperance associations form. As you can see, they're very popular with women. I think we talked a little bit about it in class before we broke, talking about the fact that, if you have a husband who's an alcoholic, as a woman, you're in a really bad spot very often. if your husband decides to take his paycheck and spend it on booze, there's nothing you can do about it. You're not going to have money to buy groceries or take care of yourself or take care of your kids. And if your husband is a violent drunk and starts slapping you around or hitting your children, there's almost nothing the law will do to protect you. There are no laws against spousal abuse. So for women, this kind of push to make alcohol illegal, there's a lot of support for that among a lot of women. This woman in the picture, she's Carrie Nation. She's she's known for that, like Hatchet, where she would come in and start breaking up bars and things like that. She's kind of a famous, Molly Hatchet. I think that's what she was called, Molly Hatchet, and she was kind of famous for busting up saloons with her axe there. All right, so in addition for fighting for temperance, the other big movement for women was the movement for suffrage. And suffrage does not mean to suffer. Please, you are going to have to go out to a tattoo parlor if you can't remember this. You have to know that suffrage means the right to vote. For the love of Pete, please remember this. Suffrage means the right to vote. So in the 1920s, this is the other big movement for women was the suffrage movement. And there was some overlap. But anyway, for women's suffrage, for those of you who had global, the women's suffrage movement really started in Europe. It was very big in England. And that same movement happens in the United States as well. There were two different movements, the National American Women's Suffrage Association. They were a little bit more, they kind of went by the book, and this is the one with Elizabeth Cady Stanton. You should remember her. We talked about her back when we talked about where this started, right? The women's suffrage movement starts way back when. Do you remember? Seneca Falls. And what document was produced at Seneca Falls? The Declaration of Sentiments, okay? You have to remember the Declaration of Sentiments, and Seneca Falls is where this starts. And that's, way back in the 1800s. But now we're in the 1920s and it's still continuing. And the big name is, of course, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. You may see her on the Regents. You also may see Susan B. Anthony, but she hasn't come up on the Regents as much because she's more well known. And there's also the National Women's Party. They were known for being a little bit more radical, a little bit more violent. But again, this kind of suffrage and the push for suffrage is finally going to work out in the 1920s. And this is where we're going to see that women are going to finally, after fighting for how long, since the start of the country, finally women are going to gain the right to vote. And the argument is first that, women had been the ones who worked in the factories during World War I and, had supported the war effort. And also the fact that when you give women the right to vote, a lot of those women had voted for suffrage. What happens is women's suffrage comes at different periods in different parts of the country. Different states had granted women the right to vote at different times. So, for example, a lot of Western states had given women the right to vote very early on. And different states kind of came at it at different times. But by the 1920s, once we have a women's rights amendment, not a women's, but a women's suffrage amendment rather. Once we have that amendment, now it's a national decision. Okay. So like I said, in the 1920s, you have two amendments. The 18th Amendment is Prohibition, which makes alcohol illegal. And the 19th Amendment gives women the right to vote. So these are two amendments that passed in the 1920s. Like I said, the Prohibition, which is, again, this is this movement that you have to know the name of, which is, again, the Temperance movement. Okay, the Temperance movement gets the 18th Amendment. That makes alcohol illegal. And the 19th Amendment, which is where women gain suffrage. Women gain the right to vote, finally. All right, so now this is a quick video. It's less than a minute. And this is from a TV show where this is kind of this place where they're counting down to Prohibition. All right. So the law has been passed. This 18th Amendment had been passed. And alcohol, as soon as it strikes midnight, alcohol will be illegal. So in this bar, these people are counting down to prohibition.
9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Prohibition!
So now the question is, well, wait a second. They had just announced prohibition had started, and now alcohol is illegal. And so he says, oh, wah, wah, wah. And then, midnight strikes and goes, it's prohibition. And what's the reaction? Are people sad? Are people upset? No. If you notice, the woman cracked champagne and they're partying and they act like, it doesn't even stop them, right? And that's the thing. Whoops, Daisy. Let me go to the next one. That's the thing about prohibition, that literally there is just no respect for this law. Everybody ignores it. The party continues. So you can see, like this picture, in compliance with the 18th Amendment, no intoxicating liquor is allowed on the premises. And then look at their table. They're covered in liquor bottles. And that's the thing about the 18th Amendment. There is literally no respect for the law. And this is where you get terms like bootleg, which is where you manufacture or illegally distribute liquor. So, for example, if you bathtub gin or something like that, like you could create a still and make your own liquor, that might be bootleg liquor. Another version of bootleg liquor is, let's say, in Canada, for example, it's legal to sell alcohol. So people might smuggle in liquor from Canada, or they might smuggle it in from the Caribbean. A speakeasy, those are illegal bars that serve alcohol. There is still some actually in New York City. When you guys turn 21, you can kind of check them out, where there'll be bars where there'll be like secret entrances where they still exist from this era of prohibition. They're actually pretty cool. They're fun bars. And then the last thing that you may hear about is the Volstead Act. This is the National Prohibition Act. So basically, once you pass the 18th Amendment, the Volstead Act is the law that shows how you're going to carry out the 18th Amendment. Okay? So, like I said, everybody's going to ignore it. People are still going to use alcohol, even though it's been made illegal. And the reason why they're able to use alcohol and that the 18th Amendment doesn't stop them is because organized crime, the mafia, the mob, is going to step up and meet that demand. And it is going to make them tons of money. So instead of alcohol raising money legally, being something that's taxed, being something that, where you have like a legal store and, companies making money from it, instead you make mobsters very, very rich. And of course, being able to control liquor sales, because it was so valuable, because selling liquor made them so much money, it ends up creating a lot of violence. Like you can see on the top, the Valentine's Day Massacre was a famous there was a mob war between the Italian mafia and the Irish mafia. And the Valentine's Day Massacre is where the Italian mafia basically takes out a huge group of Irish mobsters and to have control over liquor sales. And of course, the person on the bottom, right, that is the very famous mobster, Al Capone. And he was famous for the fact that he made tons of money, got super, super rich, basically selling liquor to individuals. So, as I said, with prohibition, it actually does not last long. So it's passed in the 1920s, but by 1933, it will be repealed. So the 18th Amendment goes bye-bye, and the one that gets rid of the 18th Amendment is the 21st Amendment. So the 18th Amendment is replaced with the 21st Amendment. 21st Amendment is basically makes alcohol sales legal again. So it is only a temporary prohibition, only lasts a short time. Okay? And with that, we are done.